I'd like to take this opportunity now to sit with a panel of experts of our colleagues and our friends. And each of the people on this panel represent one of the consortia of the IDIQ holders. We are not sure if we'll have time at the end for questions, but we'll see how the pace goes. So first, I'd like to introduce, starting from the left, we have representing the Creative Associates Consortium, Joy Duplessis. We have from the IBTCI Consortium, Steve Hansch. Representing the Louis Berger Consortium, we have Rachel Sirkin, who actually works for IREX. She has not changed companies. Representing the FHI 360 Consortium, we have Mary Mendenhall, who is a lecturer at the Teachers College at Columbia University. Representing EDC, we have Susan Ross. And for social impact, we have Sarah Jones. Thank you all for joining us today. So I want to start this panel off with the question. And I'm gonna focus on Joy and Rachel for this question. What is the most urgent challenge today for policymakers and international aid actors to advance improving education-related outcomes? And again, remember, when we talk about education-related outcomes, we're talking about enrollment, we're talking about learning, we're talking about safety. These are all included in that concept of education-related outcomes in crisis and conflict contexts, and why?
Thank you. I'd like to just start by talking about, I think we need to focus more on learning. And that may seem obvious, but I think we tend to isolate learning from things like social and emotional learning or psychosocial support and safety and all these things. So in particular, if we look at the early grades and even preschool, if we can focus more on learning, say in reading and math, I think that we'll be able to address issues of psychosocial support. For example, in reading, we know that there's a lot of evidence that talks about children's comfort levels increasing, the happiness and joy from reading, stories related to what's going on in their lives and their ability, the kids' ability to talk about those, through a reading class, with a reading teacher, with their parents. The obvious is that, you know, they'll benefit in the long run. So I feel like learning itself is kind of under-emphasized in the whole approach to education in crisis. Even though we know it's there, but if we really focus, we know how to do early reading now. We know how to do it fairly rapidly, and I think we should try to do that more.
Okay, thank you, Joy. Rachel.
So I'd like to speak more about operating on the ground. And we heard on the video about the importance of bridging the gap between research and practice. And I think I'd like to take that one step further and talk about having an open dialogue about how to strike the balance between those two things. And I think we know when we're on the ground, our pressures come not only from within the education field, but broader issues. And so there's an imperative for immediate results. And how do you make the case for what can be seen as diverting resources towards assessment or conflict analysis? That creative balance will always be there and need to be negotiated. And I think it needs to be part of our dialogue. Second point is also looking openly at the challenge of navigating how to provide U.S. assistance within a conflict environment or a crisis environment where U.S. policy perhaps has a larger role. And so I've been working quite a lot in the West Bank over the last 2 years. And I think we face this everywhere, but nowhere is it so evident, I think, about how U.S. policy impacts the ability of U.S. assistance to be effective and the amount of support that the local staff need to do that, I think, than in that area. Two more quick points. One is the importance of focusing on institutional strengthening. I think we talk a lot about infrastructure, and we've actually done a recent assessment in the West Bank This is for a program that provides non-formal education to youth, and we found that infrastructure is so much less important than the issue of trust in the institution. And for example, one of the focus group statements that I think was really telling was, we need a place to learn and not talk about the occupation. And how to build trust as far as institutional strengthening is not only about your teachers and instructors, but also about the apolitical environment and the partnerships with other community institutions or community members. The fourth point actually also came up in the video, and this is about leadership development. I don't think we do a good job as a field on leadership development. I think to be a leader in this field, you need to be a technical expert, you need to produce results and deliverables, you need to be fully compliant, and we were reminded of that again very recently, and you need to provide emotional support to your team. So that's not hard to do that all at the same time, and in a very, very charged environment. And I think our approach is sink or swim, and who suffers when we sink? So there's a skill set, and there's a need for very high emotional intelligence to navigate in that environment, so we see less of the sinking, because while our institutions suffer, I think that's less important than who really loses.
And that reminds me a little bit of what Andy was talking about this morning, about the shortcut. You know, there's no shortcut between learning and change, and I think that taking into account what you're talking about is part of that framework. Thank you. Would any other of the panelists like to answer this particular question? Any comments? Mary? Yeah.
It's hard to hold back in these things. I mean, just something that resonated with me, both talking to my colleagues in the consortium leading up to this event. I heard it in the opening session, we saw it in the video, but this, the challenge of schools under attack, and the learners themselves, and teachers, of course. So learning fundamentally important, but how many barriers do we have to pass through to get to that point? I think I saw Dia in the audience and the great work the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack is doing. But thinking about how do we, and I'm not an implementing organization obviously as an academic, but how do organizations need to now operate differently in those settings? And listening to some colleagues at FHI think about some work they were doing or planning to do in Nigeria, and having to really reconceptualize even calling their program education, because that's a problematic word. So not only coming up with something more palatable, but actually creating a program that would be, of course, accepted first and foremost by the community, but potentially by the opposition groups as well. So just something that resonated with me in the course of the conversation today.
All right, thank you. So, and I'm going to target Susan and Mary with this question, and also I think Steve. What are the most urgent evidence gaps in the field of education in conflict and crisis contexts that, if filled, would most improve our effectiveness in ensuring education for all?
I'm going to build off what Joy said, and start with, I think we need to look both at the individual level and at the institutional level. And at the individual level, I think we need to look at the learners, and those are the young people in the classrooms, but also the teacher as learners. And I do think it's the nexus in terms of learning and early grade reading results, as well as the resiliency. I do think we need to look at that integration with the social and emotional learning, the psychosocial learning. And also for teachers. Teachers are traumatized in these contexts also. And we expect a lot of teachers. Everyone, the teacher is the key. The teacher has to do this. We need to really look at how what we're doing really helps that teacher both to learn better and to be more resilient and to be able to take on the tall order that we are asking of them. And also the question of institutional strengthening, and where are the key areas which we should be providing support, and where do we see evidence of change. And maybe to take off in a little bit of a different direction, we talk more and more about, in a lot of the areas where we're working, we do need to work through partners, because partners are more effective. Not because maybe we're scared to go there also, but honestly, the partners really are more effective. But I think that demands a reconceptualization of our partnership with these organizations. And what is the shared risk? What is the shared accountability? And how can we come up with some ways of defining that and measuring that and really being probably a different kind of, maybe a better partner in these contexts?
Mary?
I mean, I think we're still coming to terms with the research base and what we need to do. I think, from the academic perspective, I think the researchers, we're actually trying to catch up to the practitioners who've been doing a wonderful job really shaping this field. I think we're still talking different languages, and we need to work out some of those serious kinks. There's a great initiative underway right now that Dana Birdie, who's a professor at NYU, is leading with her colleagues and NYU and DFID to do a very critical and robust literature review of empirical evidence primarily in this field. And I think as that begins to get released and we get more information about that, what they do find is just as interesting as what they don't find. And I think that will help us further shape our research agenda. I think if I had to nail down on one particular issue, I would piggyback a little bit on the issue of teachers. Some of the work that I've been doing with refugee teachers in Kenya, nobody's asking them what they need. Nobody's asking them how they would qualify their own needs and priorities for teacher professional development. Very few to know evaluations have been done of the teacher training programs. That is not a good thing. So I think we need to figure out robust research, and I'm a qualitative researcher, so you'll hear my bias coming through here. But we need to have a much more balanced approach to doing research about teachers and with teachers to better understand their needs and then to develop better programs.
I come from a kind of a pragmatic point of view, and I've worked a lot with NGOs, and World Vision is in our consortium, and they've done tons of education as well as health and nutrition and other things. And I guess my observation over the years is that the INE network has been a disadvantage in the larger context because the organizations that cobble together the sphere guidelines never quite see education as fitting in. And it's simply because in the health sector, the metrics are a little bit further along. We can disaggregate by age exactly what the mortality rates are. And the education sector doesn't yet have the evidence to say if you do a measles immunization for one day, you can reduce deaths by 20%. So what we have are checklists that talk about schools, desks, textbooks, teachers being depopulated, in-service training needs. But I don't see it quite as a science where we can take that and have two different organizations agree what's needed now.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. So, I wanted to go back to something we saw in the video, which was our colleague Rana from Social Impact, and she hit on some very important issues around how do we use information and knowledge to change what we do. And I want to target actually Rana's colleague, with Sarah, with this question. So while developing more focused evidence is key, which we've all just sort of discussed, it seems to me that we still have a huge challenge, which is it's not necessarily the lack of knowledge, but the use of that knowledge to inform program and policies. So as an evaluator or a researcher, what steps have you found to be most effective to translate knowledge into improved programs?
Thank you so much, Nina. I think this is a really important question for me, and I think an important question for our organization, because it's something that we try to focus on, figuring out how to make sure that the work that we do is utilized, right? At the end of the day, I'm not sitting up here because I want to do knowledge for knowledge's sake. Of course, it's interesting, and I will confess I'm a nerd. I love data. But at the same time, I'm really up here because I want to make a difference for children and youth and make sure that they have access to educational opportunities in their lives. And the way that I can do that, and that I'm best able to do that, is by providing insights into what's working well in programming, what might not be working so well, and what changes we might be able to make in order to benefit the community as a whole. And so I think the way that one of the most effective ways that we can do that is by collaboration and systematic coordination, right? And so I'm not just talking about getting together in a room and talking about how to work together, but really about looking at the research cycle and the program cycle as a whole, and looking at these things in conjunction with one another. So for example, when we're thinking about developing a new program, simultaneously be thinking about what type of research might we need to do before we start making a call for that program to be put in place. What type of monitoring and evaluation can we undertake in order to allow that program to adapt and change over time, just as Andrew mentioned earlier today about having to be adaptive. And I think those are the types of things that we can do from the onset that are really going to help benefit programming overall. As I said, I think all of us have a common goal, and that is to really make a difference at the back end. one last point that I wanted to make is that I think the other thing, in addition to coordination and collaboration, is having clear objectives and goals. We often enter the room and we think we know what each other's goals are, but sometimes we don't. So just as we've heard on the panel here, there's different perspectives on whether teaching should be the primary focus, should learning be the primary focus. I think you need to have a meeting at the beginning to understand what your overarching objectives are, and then come up with a plan on how we can design to those objectives, and then how we can measure our progress towards those objectives.
Thank you, thank you. And Steve, I think you might have something to add.
What more can you say?
No, I guess just on the issue of how to determine goals, I see different NGOs and different aid agencies looking at the same situation and come up with different goals for us. Some, the real goal is demobilizing child soldiers or preventing child soldiers. Other organizations look at the same situation and say, I know, early grade reading and literacy are our goals, or numeracy are our goals, or creating a more sustainable reform system with the ministry. And often they'll overlap, all be at the same time, and I completely agree that we are often not explicit enough.
So thank you, guys. And I think I want to ask one question to every panelist, and we'll do this sort of rapid fire coming down the line, since we're a tiny bit off on time today. So if you could, based on your experience and your observations, tell me one or two design principles that you'd like to see reflected in the next RFA or RFP that comes out. USAID people, take note. And then my second question is, if we were all sitting right here today, a year from now, what do you think the trends we'd be discussing in the field would be?
So I'm happy to start with the first question first, which is looking at the design principles for an RFA and an RFP. And I think it does speak to something I've already said, which is a really strong commitment to the design phase. I think that historically we've been so anxious to get on the ground that we often overlook and short shrift this really, really important component. And so for me, I think design, when we're talking about design, that we all need to come together as a community, as researchers, evaluators, practitioners, implementers, and talk through the design. The second piece that I would really love to see with respect to RFAs and RFPs is our ability to revisit. A lot of what we talk about are really long-term objectives, right? We could talk about the immediacy of getting children into school, but if we're talking about poverty alleviation or improved health outcomes, that's not something I'm necessarily going to know at the end of a 5-year program cycle, right? And so if there's an opportunity to re-engage 10 years down the road in some way or revisit programming from the past, I think this is crucial. I think about my dissertation work. I did my PhD in 2000, and I collected data on a 6th grade class at the KIPP Academies in Houston, Texas. That's 15 years ago now, okay? And when I was spending all day, every day in the classroom with those 11 to 13-year-olds, I had an idea of what their lives would be like. But if I had the opportunity to go back now some of them are on the cusp of no longer be considered youth under USAID policy, right? Some of them are hitting that 29-year age mark. And thinking about what they're doing to see whether or not how that program really impacted their lives in the long term, I think is essential.
Thank you. Susan.
I think rather than new principles, maybe it's a renewed importance for some of the existing principles and maybe taking them, again, to another level of depth or not seriousness, but taking the time to really implement them a little bit more. For example, country ownership. For example, analytical rigor and assessment in our design and ongoing monitoring. And maybe just the whole question of cost reasonableness, cost effectiveness in these contexts. I think the dimensions of that are also shifting and thinking a little bit more about that. So again, maybe renewing some of our principles and thinking them through in a different way.
So Mary, what will we be talking about a year from now up here?
Oh, you're going to change it up
Yeah.
on me. I would like like to see and think that we're moving in this direction, the intersection between education and peace building, and using education as a tool for peace building. And I think there are some connections there too with the conflict sensitivity approaches that we're taking, the do no harm principles that we need to more fully embrace and exceed, right? To actually do some good rather than just focusing on doing no harm. Quick.
And I'll draw on what you said, Mary. So, I think we're going to be talking about a more nuanced way to look at access data. And I think when we think about education and peace building, it also has to do with reaching marginalized groups and what equity means. And so the example of the Syrian refugees, many of them are in communities where there are schools. In Jordan, the Syrian refugees go second shift schools, and they're taught by contract teachers, and the Jordanians are very concerned about how resources might be diverted away from them and towards the Syrian refugees. And clearly this is not a recipe for a peaceful coexistence in these communities. If we're only looking at access, I think the picture looks okay. And so one of the ways that education is a tool for peace building is showing equitable access to the same quality of learning in each community.
Thank you. Steve?
A year from now, what Carl has suggested we may be all talking about is how we, as a community, deal with religious education, which is often necessary for graduation by many students, which we may be paying for as part of overall education in emergencies, which has other priorities. The two design principles that I think that we want to take into account very quickly, one is age disaggregation. I'd like to see a lot better evidence that teases out the psychosocial needs and safety outcomes, child soldier outcomes, between a 5-year-old and 15-year-old, which are worlds of difference. The second, the most important thing that obviously I want to get across today is that for the design principle, we want to see much more attention to how to achieve community buy-in and engagement, not just at the list, just at the, having talked to one community leader, but actually in the design and participation of the whole education intervention. And that's maybe critical for getting girls into schools, creating culture change in the community that also acknowledges female teachers.
Thank you. Joy,
And I'll just
last word.
Yeah, I'll just address the issue of design principles. And I think that we should be able to anticipate and have more ways of understanding the ripple effects of the programs that we have within a country. So capacity development, at all kinds of different levels, ownership, these things. How do they play out on a larger scale within communities, within nationwide? And I think there are some unifying factors in some of the work that we do that we may not leverage them enough to help support stability in a country.
Well, thank you guys so much. I mean, I feel like if you ask me what should we be doing a year from now, for me, it would be better time management. It would be great. I think we could talk forever, and I really appreciate all of you all's sort of the little taster that we're getting from your inputs and your expertise. So thank you so much, and we really look forward to the next 5 years of really being able to grapple with these issues. I mean, we're hearing about the importance of institutional strengthening. We're hearing about how important it is to actually turn evidence into practice, and what are the specific ways that we can do this. Teacher professional development, teachers being in the classroom, student well-being. I think that these are all issues that are quite important and critical for us to sort of crack that nut. Getting kids into school and keeping them in school is much bigger than, like Yolande said this morning, building schools and providing desks and chairs, which is also quite important, but really looking at this holistically. So thank you guys so much. So I think, I hope you guys have a chance to talk to these guys at the lunch break and at the coffee break. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. There was a great panel. It really already shows the partnerships and the exchange and the learning and the teaching. So thank you. Thank you for a great panel.